History, as they say, is written by the victors, except when it's written by bewildered alien civilizations trying to explain how their most sophisticated problems were solved by what they considered a barely evolved primate with a penchant for impractical solutions. The cosmic irony isn't lost on those with enough self-awareness to recognize it, which unfortunately excludes most of the self-proclaimed advanced species currently populating the galaxy. Perhaps that's getting ahead of things. Let's back up and establish some context for those not familiar with the current state of interstellar affairs. Contrary to what humans once believed, the universe isn't just teeming with life, it's practically drowning in bureaucracy. Somewhere between developing faster-than-light travel and establishing the first interstellar embassy, most species inevitably create the same labyrinthine administrative structures that seem to be as universal as the laws of physics. The Greater Galactic Cooperative, the GGC to its friends, of which it has remarkably few, represents the pinnacle of this evolutionary dead end. A sprawling collection of self-important entities who believe that any problem across 37 distinct species and approximately 12,000 inhabited worlds, children of all anatomical configurations gather around their respective guardians to hear tales of a legendary figure. Not some multi-limbed warrior from the Kreshnak dynasty, or a telepathic hive mind that solved the temporal paradox of Sector 9. No, these wide-eyed younglings beg for stories about a human. You know, those bipedal mammals from that unremarkable blue-green planet in the cosmic backwater they call the solar system? The very same species that until recently thought faster-than-light travel was just a convenient plot device for their charmingly primitive entertainment programs. Tonight, on the crystalline world of Vexthor Prime, a clutch of Exlanthe hatchlings squirms excitedly as Elder Zektal settles his 4 primary appendages into a comfortable configuration, his secondary eyes glowing with the phosphorescent blue that indicates storytelling mode. "Tell us about the human," chirp the hatchlings in unsettling unison, their translucent scales vibrating with anticipation. "Again?" Zekal's tertiary breathing apparatus releases what could only be described as a sigh, if sighs could sound simultaneously bored and amused. "Very well. But remember, little ones, this isn't just a tale. It's history." The hatchling's collective vibration intensifies to a frequency that would shatter inferior building materials. Good thing Exlanthe architecture evolved past such weaknesses several millennia ago. It all began, Zektalan tones, when the galactic community was still operating under the wildly inaccurate assumption that intelligence correlated with technological advancement. Humans had been part of the Greater Galactic Cooperative for all of 47 standard cycles, a mere eye blink in cosmic terms. Barely enough time for a Chronox to decide what to have for breakfast. They'd stumbled onto the galactic stage with all the grace of a Thulian swamp beast at a formal dinner party, brandishing their quaint chemical rockets and broadcasting their presence with electromagnetic signals so primitive that several elder species initially mistook them for background radiation having an unusually coherent day. The GGC's Department of Emerging Sentience, a bureaucratic hellscape that somehow managed to combine the inefficiency of a Prandorian slime collective with the warmth of a neutron star, had classified humans as barely space-capable primates with delusions of significance. This classification was, like most things that emerge from committees with more than 3 members, spectacularly wrong. The Diplomatic Corps, a generous term for what was essentially a collection of beings too peculiar to be useful elsewhere, assigned humanity's representatives to the equivalent of the galactic kiddie table. This is where the story truly begins, with a human diplomat whose name has since been mangled by so many non-human vocal apparatuses that pronouncing it correctly would require anatomical modifications banned in 16 sectors. For simplicity's sake, aliens across the cosmos now simply refer to her as the human. Very creative, these advanced civilizations. The human arrived at the Central Assembly on Nexus Station wearing what her species considered formal attire. a bland arrangement of fabrics that failed to change color, emit warning pheromones, or even properly display her internal organ status. Several protocol officers fainted from the perceived obscenity. "Another primitive to manage," groaned Sub-Administrator Clevox of the Taurian Cooperative, his 9 sensory stalks drooping with disdain. "Put it in the auxiliary observation chamber with the other newly spacefaring specimens." The auxiliary observation chamber was, to put it kindly, where the GGC stashed representatives they hoped would get bored and go home. To put it unkindly, which is far more accurate and infinitely more satisfying, it was the galactic equivalent of seating someone at a restaurant table next to the restrooms beneath a leaky air conditioning unit with a clear view of the dumpsters. The human merely smiled, a baring of teeth that several predatory species misinterpreted as a challenge, and took her assigned seat. For 3 full rotations, she did nothing but observe proceedings through the grainy holoprojection provided to lower-tier species. She didn't complain about the accommodations, which included a gravity setting calibrated for entities with roughly twice her mass, and atmospheric scrubbers that seemed personally offended by oxygen. What nobody realized, because advanced civilizations are remarkably skilled at overlooking the obvious when it contradicts their prejudices, was that the human was absorbing everything. While the Galactic Council droned on about trade tariffs on quantum-entangled luxury goods, she was mapping power structures, identifying informal alliances, and cataloging the small behavioral tells that even telepathic species couldn't fully suppress. On the 4th rotation, when the Kavarian delegation threatened to withdraw from the Antimatter Production Treaty because the Volox Empire had insulted the ancestral hue of their ceremonial head ridges, politics, it turns out, is equally ridiculous, regardless of how many limbs or dimensions you operate in, the human raised her hand. This simple gesture, so mundane it barely registered, would later be immortalized in no fewer than 26 epic poems, 3 interpretive dance routines, and a particularly avant-garde zero-gravity opera that caused 7 cases of irremediable motion sickness. The chair does not recognize the representative from wherever you're from, sneered Grand Arbiter Zexil, a being so ancient that several younger species believed him to be a particularly well-preserved fossil that had somehow gained sentience and a taste for bureaucratic sadism. "Earth," the human supplied helpfully, as if naming a backwater planet that most navigational systems didn't even bother to map was somehow meaningful. "Yes, yes," Zexil's chromatophorist pulsed with impatience, a display that on his homeworld would have constituted a grave insult, but in diplomatic settings was merely considered extreme rudeness. "The chair does not recognize Earth's representative because Earth holds no standing in mineral rights disputes." "I'm not seeking to address the mineral rights," the human replied with that same disconcerting smile. "I simply wanted to point out that everyone seems to be overlooking the obvious solution to the translation problem." The chamber fell silent, not the respectful silence of attention, but the awkward silence of collective second-hand embarrassment. Several species capable of manipulating their own time perception actually accelerated their personal timelines to make the moment pass faster. "Translation problem," echoed Sub-Administrator Clevox, his sensory stalks now rigid with indignation. "There is no translation problem. We employ the most sophisticated universal translation matrices in the known universe." The human nodded agreeably. "Yes, and they're mistranslating the Kavarian ceremonial greeting. What the Volvox interpreter rendered as, 'Your ancestors displayed chromatic inadequacy,' was actually meant as, 'Your lineage's colors inspire contemplation.' The entire dispute is based on a programming error in the cultural context subroutines." One could have heard a subatomic particle drop in the silence that followed. Grand Arbiter Zixil's chromatophores went through such a complex sequence of colors that 3 art critics in attendance immediately declared it a masterpiece and began bidding for recording rights. A hasty verification confirmed the human's assessment. The translation error was corrected, the treaty crisis averted, and the human returned to silent observation, as if she hadn't just prevented an interstellar diplomatic incident that could have destabilized antimatter production across 3 spiral arms. This should have been the end of it. A minor diplomatic save, perhaps worthy of a footnote in some obscure archival database. But the universe, with its twisted sense of humor, was just warming up 2 weeks later because humans insist on dividing time into these peculiar units based on their planet's arbitrary rotational relationship with a completely unremarkable star. The Central Assembly faced a more substantial problem. The drift? A region of space where normal physical laws took creative liberties, with concepts like cause and effect and object permanence, had expanded by 16% overnight, swallowing 3 inhabited systems and a popular vacation resort known for its gravity-defying water features. The Theoretical Physics Consortium, a collection of the galaxy's most brilliant minds, all of whom had evolved beyond physical forms, except for the parts required to look down on less evolved species, presented their findings, with the kind of smugness that transcends biological and non-biological intelligence alike. The drift's expansion follows a 9-dimensional algorithmic pattern that cannot be altered without catastrophic consequences to the underlying quantum substrate, announced Overmind Prime, its thought projection so dense with complex mathematical symbols that 3 delegates developed spontaneous migraines. We recommend immediate evacuation of all systems within the projected expansion zone. The projected expansion zone encompassed 27 inhabited worlds, 4 major trade routes, and, most catastrophically, the galaxy's largest repository of vintage fermented beverages. Priorities, it seems, remain consistent across species boundaries. As pandemonium erupted in the chamber, a spectacular display ranging from ultrasonic keening to pheromonal emissions so potent they triggered emergency ventilation protocols, the human once again raised her hand. This time, Grand Arbiter Zuxel pretended not to notice, a strategy that might have worked if Ambassador Tlix of the Folian Collective hadn't helpfully pointed directly at her with 3 of his sensory appendages while shouting, "The Earth creature wishes to speak," in a tone suggesting he'd just discovered fire, with the reluctance of someone about to eat something they found at the back of a food storage unit. Zexil acknowledged the human. "While I hesitate to question the impressive calculations of the Theoretical Physics Consortium," the human began, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing an explosive device, "has anyone attempted to communicate with the drift?" The silence that followed made the previous silence seem positively chatty. "Communicate with a spatial anomaly?" Overmind Prime's thought projection carried the distinct tone of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly dense rock. "The drift is not sentient. It is a complex quantum phenomenon with multi-dimensional properties that defy standard." "Yes, but have you checked?" The human persisted with the stubborn practicality that would later be cited in xenobiology textbooks as a distinctly human form of cognitive deficiency that occasionally produces useful results through sheer statistical probability. As it turned out, no one had checked. Not because the idea was completely absurd, though several species insisted on describing it as such in increasingly florid terms, but because the kind of intelligence that designs 9-dimensional theoretical models rarely stops to consider whether the subject of those models might simply respond to a polite hello. Against all recommendations and several direct orders, the human requisitioned a small research vessel with outdated communication arrays. When denied, she somehow acquired one anyway, through methods that have since become the subject of at least 14 contradictory legends and 1 unauthorized holovid series with terrible special effects. With a hastily assembled crew of scientific misfits, beings whose careers had been sidelined for crimes ranging from excessive creativity in research methodology to suggesting Grand Arbiter Zexil might occasionally be wrong, she piloted to the edge of the drift. What happened next has been documented in official GGC records as Anomalous Event K7112. Unauthorized communication with spatial distortion leading to unexpected resolution. This bureaucratic masterpiece of understatement obscures the fact that the human basically had a conversation with what turned out to be a semi-sentient region of space-time that had evolved from an abandoned experiment in dimensional engineering. The details of this conversation remain classified at the highest levels, but eyewitness accounts, mostly from the ship's maintenance droid who had no stake in proceedings but an unexpectedly poetic recording protocol, suggest that the human explained concepts like personal boundaries and consent before expanding into someone's neighborhood to an entity that existed partially outside conventional reality. Within 72 hours, the drift had receded to its original boundaries, releasing the swallowed systems largely intact, though the popular vacation resort now featured gravity that worked sideways on Tuesdays. An alteration that, ironically, tripled its bookings among thrill-seeking tourists. The human returned to a mixture of acclaim and suspicion. The Theoretical Physics Consortium demanded her research methodology. There wasn't one. And her data, she had taken notes on what a Maclaurin observer described as pressed tree pulp using a stick that leaks pigmented fluid. Several elder races began the lengthy process of revising fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and the wisdom of engaging in conversations with the fabric of space-time. What followed was perhaps the most amusing spectacle in recent galactic memory: the formation of the Interspecies Human Understanding Committee. 17 distinct species, each convinced of their superior intellect, gathered in solemn assembly to decode the mysterious thought processes that had enabled a primitive mammal to solve a crisis their finest minds couldn't comprehend. The committee produced a 12,000-page report that managed to be simultaneously thorough and entirely miss the point. They attributed the human success to everything from quantum entanglement with parallel consciousness to fortunate evolutionary quirks in primate problem-solving. Not one of them considered the possibility that sometimes the simplest approach is just to ask. Grand Arbiter Zexil, never one to miss an opportunity for bureaucratic expansion, created 3 new subcommittees dedicated to human cognitive analysis. These committees promptly disappeared into the administrative equivalent of a black hole, generating meeting minutes so dense that several clerical staff complained of developing migraines simply from filing them. Meanwhile, the human continued her diplomatic work with the baffling nonchalance her species often displayed toward their own accomplishments. When the Agrillian ambassador asked her directly how she had known the drift might be sentient, her response, "I just figured anything that complicated probably had opinions about stuff," was enshrined in the diplomatic archives as an example of advanced metaphorical reasoning, rather than the straightforward explanation it actually was. Perhaps most telling was the reaction of the quantum collective beings, who existed as probability clouds rather than discrete entities. After reviewing the drift incident, they petitioned the Central Assembly to reclassify humans as paradoxical intelligence, simultaneously less and more advanced than they appear. The petition was denied on procedural grounds. Form QCE 11372B had been submitted in triplicate rather than quadruplicate. But the sentiment began to spread throughout the more thoughtful corners of the galactic community. You might think this would be enough to cement someone's reputation across the galaxy. You would be wrong, because the universe was saving its pièce de résistance, a French human phrase that most translation matrices render as the thing that makes everything before it look like a warm-up act. 6 standard months later, as the humans' exploits had begun to fade from the collective memory of a galactic community with the attention span of particularly distractible quantum particles, the unthinkable happened. A void Leviathan, one of those cosmic horrors that most civilizations sensibly pretend doesn't exist, emerged from the depths of intergalactic space and parked itself in orbit around Nexus Station. For those unfamiliar with void leviathans, lucky you, imagine a creature large enough to use gas giants as stress balls, with cognitive architecture so alien that merely attempting to comprehend its motivations has been known to cause spontaneous existential crises. Most species' reaction to a void leviathan can be summarized as immediate, undignified evacuation, followed by changing one's species name and hoping it doesn't find you. The Central Assembly, displaying the cool-headed leadership that had made it the laughingstock of 3 galactic supercusters, immediately devolved into chaos. The Defense Fleet, an impressive collection of warships whose primary function seemed to be appearing in recruitment propaganda, moved into standard formation, which is to say, as far from the Leviathan as possible, while still technically being in the same star system. 7 different religious groups declared it the end times, which was awkward for their adherents, who had already scheduled apocalypses for later in the fiscal quarter. Insurance companies galaxy-wide simultaneously updated their policies to exclude cosmic horror incidents, demonstrating that some concepts truly are universal. The Void Leviathan, for its part, seemed content to orbit Nexus Station, while occasionally sending pulses of unknown energy that transformed all station communications into what linguists would later identify as cosmic whale songs, with existential overtones. As evacuation reached frantic levels and several elder races began the process of transferring their consciousness into more portable storage mediums, a small transport vessel broke from the Exodus and moved toward the Leviathan. You've already guessed who was piloting it. Security protocols were ignored, override codes mysteriously appeared, and at least one high-ranking official later admitted to looking the other way because, in his words, if anyone was going to do something impossibly stupid that might actually work, it would be the human. The human's vassal approached the Void Leviathan in what seasoned spacefarers recognized as an utterly suicidal trajectory. What happened next was captured by long-range sensors, but made so little sense that most analysts initially assumed the recording equipment had malfunctioned. The human broadcast toward the Leviathan, not using the sophisticated communication arrays developed by the foremost minds in xenolinguistics, but instead through her vessel's external maintenance speaker system. And what she broadcast wasn't a carefully crafted diplomatic overture or mathematical sequence designed to establish common ground with an alien intelligence. It was music, human music, the kind with rhythmic patterns and harmonic progressions that most advanced species had evolved beyond in favor of more sophisticated arrangements, based on quantum fluctuations and tidal patterns of neutron stars. For 16 excruciating minutes, the human bombarded a cosmic horror capable of unraveling reality with what was later identified as a playlist containing everything from classical symphonies to something called disco, that several cultural experts insisted had to be some form of auditory warfare. The Void Leviathan, a being that had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, that existed partially in dimensions mortals couldn't perceive without their brains leaking out their sensory orifices, stopped. Just stopped. Its energy emissions shifted, its massive form altered orientation, and it produced what sensor technicians initially classified as a catastrophic structural failure, but later revised to dance-adjacent movements. 3 hours later, after what observers could only describe as an impromptu concert for an audience of one very large cosmic horror, the Void Leviathan departed. It left behind no destruction, no existential dread, just a peculiar gravitational ripple that, when analyzed, proved to be a perfect mathematical recreation of a human song's chorus. The human returned to Nexus Station to find herself greeted not as a savior but as a security risk. Grand Arbiter Zexel, whose emergency evacuation pod had experienced a convenient malfunction that prevented his departure, demanded an explanation that would satisfy the 17 different security councils now investigating the incident. It was lonely, the human said simply. The Void Leviathan, an entity that predates most sentient life in this galaxy, was lonely? Zexil's chromatophores displayed the unique pattern that xenobiologists had recently classified as trying to process human logic. Yes, the human confirmed. It's been traveling between galaxies for so long it forgot what it was like to hear a new song. So I played it some music, and this music convinced an incomprehensible cosmic entity to spare us? The human shrugged, a gesture that several species still struggle to interpret correctly. Everyone likes a good beat. News of the encounter spread faster than a quantum entanglement breach. Within days, human music became the most searched term on the Galactic Information Network. 17 previously obscure human composers suddenly found their works being played in high council chambers across 3 spiral arms. The Andromedan Cultural Exchange, which had previously dismissed human artistic expression as endearingly primitive pattern creation, hastily organized a symposium titled Rhythmic Vibrations as Cosmic Diplomacy: Implications for Intergalactic Relations. Most amusing was the rush among elite socialites to demonstrate their sudden expertise in human musical traditions. The Cephean ambassador hosted a gala where guests wore approximations of human attire and attempted to perform something called the robota, a dance move that, ironically, actual robots found deeply offensive, for reasons no one could adequately explain. Several entrepreneurial entities established human music academies, promising to teach the secret sonic patterns that could supposedly control cosmic horrors. The human, when asked to endorse these ventures, declined with characteristic bluntness. "That's not how music works." Or, "Cosmic horrors, probably." The most profound impact, however, came in the form of a quiet revolution in xenobiological studies. For centuries, the prevailing approach to encountering new life forms had been built on complex theoretical frameworks and non-intervention protocols. Now a new school of thought emerged, dubbed applied human pragmatism by its proponents, and reckless primate methodology by its detractors. Its central tenet could be summarized as, "Have you tried saying hello first?" Elder Zichtal's voice modulates to indicate the story is nearing its conclusion. The Ixlanthe hatchlings have been unnaturally still throughout the tale, their usual fidgeting suspended in rapt attention. After the Void Leviathan incident, everything changed. Zichtal continues, "The human was appointed to the newly created position of unconventional crisis response specialist, though many suspect this was simply to keep closer watch on her." The species classification system underwent its first major revision in 12,000 cycles, with humans upgraded from barely space-capable primates to deceptively simple bipeds with disturbing problem-solving capabilities. Some elder races even began studying human history, an unprecedented step that revealed humans had spent their entire pre-space civilization period solving problems through methods that ranged from charmingly simplistic to "why would anyone ever think to try that?" When the human eventually retired from diplomatic service, 17 different species offered her citizenship. She declined them all, returning to that unremarkable blue-green planet where, by all accounts, she lived a quiet life teaching young humans to question assumptions and talk to things before trying to mathematically model them out of existence. "Is it true?" asks one of the braver hatchlings, secondary eyes glowing with curiosity, "that she once convinced the combined fleet admiral to retreat from battle by explaining the concept of a bluff?" Zichtal's breathing apparatus produces what might be a chuckle. "That's a story for another time, but yes." Though the official records call it strategic position reassessment based on incomplete intelligence. Another hatchling vibrates at a frequency indicating deep thought. "Elder, why do we tell stories about this human? There are 17,842,619,412,307 humans now registered in GGC space. Why remember just one?" Zichtal extends his primary sensory appendage in the gesture that indicates profound wisdom is about to be dispensed. The hatchlings instinctively lean forward, because, little ones, she reminded the galaxy of something it had forgotten in its rush toward advancement. That sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective. That communication doesn't always require quantum entanglement and 9-dimensional models. That music and stories and simply talking to something can change the course of history. He pauses, his outer membrane rippling with what the hatchlings will someday recognize as ironic amusement. "And because the universe has a peculiar sense of humor, For all our advancements, for all our evolved consciousness and technological marvels, it took a being from a species still working out how to efficiently harness their own sun's energy to teach us that intelligence comes in many forms, and that assuming your way is the only way is the surest path to missing the obvious solution right in front of you. The hatchlings pulse with satisfaction, a story well told and lessons absorbed. As they disperse to their regeneration chambers, Elder Zektal's tertiary eyes catch the distant gleam of Earth's sun through the crystalline dome overhead, an unremarkable star that produced perhaps the most remarkable species the galaxy has yet encountered. Somewhere out there, new crises are unfolding, new threats emerging, and in council chambers across thousands of worlds, the first question asked is no longer, "What do our most advanced models predict?" but rather, "What would the human do?" The universe, it seems, has learned to appreciate the elegant simplicity of asking the simplest questions, and occasionally playing a good song to entities that can devour solar systems. After all, anyone can design a nine-dimensional theoretical model. It takes a human to suggest asking a spatial anomaly about its feelings.